So it's the second night of the Republican National Convention. I was going to say from Charlotte, North Carolina, but format of both of these conventions is not normal. So they're not really, I don't know if we can even say they're from the city that was scheduled to host the events. I mean, in the case of the Democrats, Milwaukee, and the Republicans, Charlotte. I understand Mike Pompeo will be delivering his speech from Israel, which I think will be a first. So I've been watching snippets of these conventions. Usually I will watch a lot more of them because format being what it is. I'm just getting snippets, maybe watching some of the keynote speeches online as they're uploaded later and so on. I understand the First Lady will be speaking tonight. Um, the Trump attack lines are going to be quite obvious, not just from Trump himself. I mean, it was said that Donald Trump Jr.'s speech was Trumpier than Trump. Some of it was a bit cringy, almost cartoonish insults. Beijing Biden, for example, that's petulant. Um, Having said that, I do think the Democrats need to be quite assertive about where these attack lines are going to be. Now, just from my own position, I'm an outsider, but I do have opinions on this. And let me just be candid. I think Donald Trump's a disaster. I think he is the worst president of modern times, and I can name a lot of reasons why I believe that to be the case. His handling of coronavirus, a pandemic that claimed 170,000 plus American lives, is awful. And you could argue that whoever is in office is going to be a high death toll, but this is a president who denied it from the start. This is a president who has conducted foreign policy often through Twitter rants, who has attacked Western institutions whilst praising foreign dictators. I mean, this just goes on and on and on. I try to be fair to Trump, so when I think he's done things that are the right policy, the right move, I'll give him credit for that. For example, his administration took out Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, right? Ruthless terrorist. That was a good thing, but it isn't. That in itself can't be seen as um, the whole picture of the Trump foreign policy. It's good. It was a good move. The Iran nuclear deal, I've honestly got mixed opinions on that because I think it's the sort of thing that we can only tell over time. Moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, I think it was a sentimental move aimed at giving a nod to America's close ally Israel. I don't know if it was particularly necessary. When it comes to Holy Land, I'm broadly more pro-Israel, but I'm not sure that was a particularly geopolitically necessary move. Um, Taking on the Assad regime in terms of the bombing campaign against both Assad and ISIS, I'm not going to argue against that. I've supported those moves. I support them from the British government. But the problem with Trump is there is a real inconsistency. I mean, take China, for example. I give the administration credit for standing up for Taiwan. I think that's a good thing because Taiwan is the only Chinese speaking part of the world that is democratic. Um, I think, Hong Kong is no longer Hong Kong. So the fact that the Trump administration has stood up for the courageous leadership of Taiwan, I think that deserves credit. So I'll give him credit for that. Um, However, the picture that the administration's putting out that Trump's been tough on China and Biden's weak, I don't think it shows the whole picture because Trump's record on this hasn't been consistent. His stance on Hong Kong was, I'm sure they'll sort something out. And he openly said that he thought the concentration camps in Xinjiang sounded like a good idea. Now, even if that was just speculative, to even give any sort of overtures to China in that way, I think is disgraceful. I don't think that Trump is really motivated by human rights. So I don't think Trump's tough line on China has got much to do with human rights. I think a lot of it's to do with the geopolitical standoff between the world's two most powerful countries. Now, I'm a Westerner. I will always back the West over China every time. But I also think that you need some sort of exemplary leadership from the top. And when you have a president who has constantly attacked the media, Trump, frankly, behaves more like a dictator at times than the leader of the free world. And I don't say that lightly. The fact he's already trying to delegitimize this election is incredible. The fact he advocated domestic insurrection against elected state governors who were imposing lockdown measures that are have been used all over the world. You know, the fact he promoted insurrection against those governors, I think, was an absolute disgrace. I just don't know how any educated person can, with a straight face, be an enthusiastic Trump supporter at the moment. I can understand them being critical of Biden. I can understand them being critical of the Democrats. But I would say if that's your position, it doesn't by default mean you have to enthusiastically support Trump. I have friends who are centrists, they're moderates, and they don't particularly care for the Democrats right now. But some of them seem to think that means they need to praise Trump. I don't think that's a default option. I'm not suggesting people go for a third party option, but um, obviously only one of these two men is going to be the next president, either Donald Trump in continuation or Joe Biden. There was a professor, I forget his name now, but he has accurately predicted every election of the last 30, 40 years. He accurately predicted that Trump would win in 2016. Now, he has used a series of criteria for this, such as charisma of the candidate, the state of the economy, if there is domestic disorder. There was a whole range of things. And it was close, but the final conclusion was that Joe Biden would win this election. So his prediction, so to speak, was in keeping with what all the polls are suggesting. But I think Biden and the Democrats are also wary not to be too complacent because there may well be the silent Trump voter who says one thing to a pollster but then actually goes and votes for Trump and Pence. So I've been thinking about this a lot recently, in the last few days. I mean, I was watching the Bush Dukakis debate earlier. That was actually quite, we sometimes think because the Trump Clinton debates were so dramatic, previous debates were very mute. Not quite. The Bush Dukakis debate of 1988 was quite, oh, I wouldn't say it was entirely gentlemanly. It was quite barbed at times. Um, However, I really think this one is going to be, you know, the swords are going to come out, so to speak. Pistols coming out, to be more accurate for the American situation. I think it's going to be fireworks. That's my speculation about the debates. In terms of Harris and Pence, Pence isn't Trump. He has a very different style in debating, and I think Harris needs to be careful with that. Um, but here's my two major concerns about the Democrats. So, okay, I put my cards out there. I I want Trump out of office. I think the man's a liability. I don't think he's consistent. I think the things that are held up to support him are all flawed. Strong economy, well, it's looking shaky. Even if it's a long-term problem, it's looking shaky. No question about that. Its handling of coronavirus has been a disaster. Um, he hasn't went beyond his base. There's a lot of Republicans turning against the president. I can't think of the last time when an incumbent president has had so much of his own party against him. Um, and the one of the major talking points that the Trump campaign uses strong on China. Okay, there's a trade war. Okay, there's tough rhetoric from the White House, and some of that I welcome. I do think it's important to have tough rhetoric with China, but I would make the point that Trump's record on this hasn't entirely been consistent. If Trump thought that turning a blind eye to the situation in Xinjiang was good for economics, I think he would. However, that's that. Thinking just of the Democrats now, I have two major concerns about Biden and Harris. Notwithstanding personal things, for example, Biden's age, which sometimes shows. My major concern about Biden is on China. I don't think that he is the China puppet that Trump and Trump Jr. and Pompeo and so on make him out to be, Nikki Haley. However, I don't think he's doing anywhere near enough to counter that. Biden has condemned China's human rights record in the past. I think he needs to be very vocal about this because the Trump campaign is absolutely going to use that. China right now is more hawkish than it's ever been. It is more jingoistic than it's ever been. Under Xi Jinping, it has been throwing its weight around, not just in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, but in the South China Sea. It's been stoking up the diaspora. It lied about coronavirus to the World Health Organization. There's a long list of things that China has been doing that Western liberal democracies and any other countries for that matter that have a vested interest in this cannot ignore. And I think if Biden and Harris think that it should be just back to normal with China, they're deluded. I want to see Biden and Harris talking tough with China, not just to counter Trump campaign attacks, but because it's the right thing to do. One of my big contentions with the Democrats is early. One thing the Trump campaign did get right was cutting off flights from China. The Democrats, portrayed that to be a racist thing. And I think in New York City earlier in the pandemic, they went ahead with Chinese New Year celebrations, with crowds. That was a big mistake by Democrat-run New York City. So there's a lot of valid criticism to be made of the Trump administration over their handling of coronavirus, but the Democrats don't come out clean when it comes to China. I think, yes, they have made statements regarding human rights in the past, but by the way, I wouldn't trust anything that China says on this. Some people are being looking into the fact that China supposedly wants Trump to continue, or excuse me, China favors Biden. In fact, this apparently Global Times made an editorial about that. I wouldn't weigh much onto that because I honestly think both China and Russia want nothing more than the West to be at loggerheads with itself over how to handle China and Russia. So the nature of democratic politics, obviously, there's going to be debate on this, but I think, the Chinese Communist Party could be playing a clever game here. They could give the impression that they want Biden as president in order to notch up the rhetoric from Trump, in order to see Trump defeated, um, or they could be actually trying to notch up the rhetoric from uh, the Biden side, to go on the counterattack in order to see Trump defeated because they want Trump out of office, or because they don't want Biden in office. They want Trump to win by kind of getting this domestic schism going. I honestly wouldn't believe anything that comes from China in terms of, oh, China backs Biden. I wouldn't trust that. Um, I don't think China wants Biden any more than Trump. That's my gut feeling. Um, but I do think that Biden needs to be a lot more vocal, and it angers me, quite frankly, that the Democrats and the American left in general, and the British left to an extent, they portray criticism of China as xenophobia. They need to make a very, very clear difference between racist attacks on Chinese nationals, um, versus legitimate criticism of the CCP. And for that matter, I would say it's valid to criticize individual Chinese who are behaving in a nationalistic way. I think, for example, Chinese students, and this might be controversial, but if they go to an American campus and wave the flag around, then, respect is a two-way street. They can't then play the victim. Um, I think the West needs to wake up in general. But my big concern is, Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, France. Japan, every country that has a vested interest is concerned about China, but only the United States is more powerful than China. That's why it's essential that there is assertive leadership from Washington. That's why it's essential that a President Joe Biden will be tough on China. And I'm not saying that just for the sake of it, just for the sake of muscle flexing. I'm saying it because apathy cannot be the solution. Appeasement cannot be the solution. I want to see a Biden Harris administration understanding that what China is doing in Xinjiang is morally repugnant. I want a Biden Harris administration recognizing that this Chinese regime is trying its level best to undermine Western democracies in a whole range of ways. I think Pompeo was right to talk tough regarding Huawei. And it troubles me that there's people in Britain that say, "Oh, the Americans are interfering. It's not up to them what we do with Huawei." But the point is, Huawei can't be trusted. It doesn't matter what Huawei representatives say; they have to answer to the Chinese Communist Party. So that's my big concern. I don't think Biden and Harris have been anywhere near vocal enough about China. I've looked at the website, the main campaign website, and there's nothing there that stands out that really convinces me. If I was a swaying American voter, I'd be thinking, okay, as I think it was Walter Mondale said, where's the beef? Where's the beef? There needs to be tougher rhetoric about China, not for the sake of it, but because geopolitically right now it is the right move. There cannot be a situation where and this is true of too many American presidents before Trump and other Western leaders, British prime ministers as well, where there is this kind of idea in the West that, oh, we'll just kind of have good relations with China as the economy grows. There'll be reforms domestically and we can work with China. But this isn't just about human rights, important as that is. I don't believe that we can trust the Chinese Communist Party. This is a regime that lies to its own people. I think the only thing they care about is power, and I think they're hell bent on becoming number one in the world. That's natural. Why not? Why wouldn't they? But that's a problem because as soon as China gets to the number one position, if they can manipulate the World Health Organization as they did with this pandemic, they can manipulate, and I don't think this is hyperbole, they can manipulate what is controlled on the internet. If you get Chinese tech giants that start surpassing Facebook and YouTube and other Western companies, we will get to a situation where they're controlling the internet. And it won't just be difficult to criticize the CCP within China, it will actually become a problem outside China. And that's scary. I don't think it's hyperbole. I think we need to wake up to the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is a thug regime. It cannot be trusted. They're professional liars. They insult our allies. Remember, they called Australia, by they, I'm talking about Global Times. You know, it's a mouthpiece of the Communist Party. They called them chewing gum on our shoes. Now, I don't say any of this lightly because a very big part of my life has been about China. I've lived and worked there twice. I have many Chinese friends, but I don't equivocate on where my values lie, and I will never ever back a single party communist regime over Western democracy. It will never happen. I may have great affection for Chinese culture, China the country, but I don't believe we can trust the CCP. I think the West has tried that, and I don't think it's worked. So if nothing else, at least the Trump administration has changed the rhetoric, and that's not entirely a bad thing. So the Democrats, if they want to portray this as racist, I think they're barking the wrong way. I think they need to get tough and assertive, and they could do that without vilifying Chinese Americans. You know, there's patriotic Chinese Americans like Andrew Yang and others. Um, I don't think it's a conclusion that if you talk tough with Beijing, that means you're polarizing Chinese Americans. But I would respectfully say to Chinese Americans, if you interpret it that way, then you're reading it wrong. You know, if you get racist abuse on the street, that's totally wrong. No one should have to put up with that. But you know, I do suspect some people are being too sensitive and jumping to conclusions. For example, just because the Trump administration talked about the China virus doesn't mean they're vilifying all Chinese Americans. Maybe it's reckless rhetoric. I made a previous video on this. Maybe it's better to say the CCP virus, or just call it what it is, the coronavirus. But I don't agree that the natural conclusion, therefore, is, oh, that's an attack on all Chinese Americans. Um, the fact of the matter is, the CCP did mislead the world on this. In those critical early weeks, they withheld information. They punished Dr. Li Wenliang. Those are the facts. And I think those foolish Westerners primarily on the political left, who think that tough rhetoric with China equals muscle flexing rather than realpolitik, they need to wake up, because there is nothing liberal about appeasing the Chinese regime. That's not a liberal or progressive position. Quite the opposite, in fact. So I think the Trump campaign is going to use that, and I think the Biden campaign needs to be very aware of it. Not just for this election. I want to see a Biden presidency that has the right position on this, being tough and assertive. It's essential, because if they go back to normal, oh, let's just have relationships with China as normal. China's just going to see that as an invitation to walk over the West. We can't allow that to happen. The second thing is more domestic thing. This has been an incredibly turbulent year in terms of the social situation. And the Trump campaign is painting this picture that if Biden becomes president, America's going to be a wasteland of law and disorder. They're painting this very scary dystopian picture. I would say America's already in a lot of trouble. Um, you know, gun crime is rising in the inner cities, which yes are Democratic controlled, but the president hasn't been a unifying figure. He has been extremely partisan on this. And I'm not talking about Black Lives Matter. I mean that, he hasn't approached this with trying to understand both sides. The president hasn't really tried to understand the legitimate anger over police brutality, for example. So, on the other hand, he will say quite accurately that look at Democrat controlled cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, etc. The crime levels in those cities are really out of control. And I think the Trump campaign will say, if you get a President Biden, that's going to be the situation. I don't think the Democratic National Convention had any Black Lives Matter speakers. Um, well, they had George Floyd's family, I understand, but I don't know, for example, if they had any organizers of Black Lives Matter. They need to be very careful with that, because frankly, Black Lives Matter is a very controversial organization, an organization that has racist members, that has vilified and dehumanized all white people. An example being Yusra Kogali, co-founder of the Toronto chapter. This is an organization that has some very far left policies, like wanting to abolish prison completely. But that doesn't go in line with the Biden camp's actual policies. Um, and they are connected with law and disorder. It's false to say, as some senior Democrats have, that Black Lives Matter has been a peaceful organization. It hasn't. Only recently, a white trucker it was either Portland or Seattle, I think it was Portland, was dragged from his truck, beaten to a pulp. So, as far as I'm concerned, Black Lives Matter is a liability, and the Democrats need to be careful not to be too closely aligned with them. Certainly listen to their concerns, but they need to be a bit careful about not being seen as the party of anarchy, basically. Um, Michelle Obama, I noticed, said all lives matter. She didn't say Black Lives Matter, ironically. So those people that get really worked up about the statement all lives matter, Michelle Obama said that in her speech. We need to be in America where all lives matter. It's not verbatim, but she used that expression, all lives matter. Um, what I'm encouraged about with Biden, I do think he is reaching out for moderates. I do think he's reaching out for centrists. And I really don't buy this thing that he is going to be a puppet for the far left. But it is up to his campaign to show that as well. Um, Both Harris and Biden have some baggage, and The thing is, Kamala Harris isn't exactly loved by the progressives. She's not entirely trusted. But to me, that's not an entirely bad thing because it means that she's not far left. So those two things, China and law and order, are the two areas I think the Trump campaign's really going to attack Biden on. So he and Harris need to be very, very wary of this and be prepared for an answer. And the way to do that is not just to attack Trump, they need to provide an answer for the American people. And frankly, for others as well, because the United States is the most powerful country in the world. So, whilst of course it's up to the American people, and they're the people who vote, you know, there is a reason why the rest of us pay attention. And those Americans who say, oh, mind your own business, well, I would say there is responsibility with being in the number one spot. If you're the most powerful country in the world, you can't really complain outsiders taking interest because it has implications for the rest of us. Okay, I'll leave it there. Obviously, I don't have a vote. It's not up to me, but I just feel there are simply too many concerns about the way this administration has has conducted itself. So, if I was American, I'd be willing to give Biden and Harris a shot, quite frankly.